I wasn't unable to be at school today, but I decided to leave a video of notes for you. So as you watch this video, you should be filling out page 258 in your notes, okay? And then we're just going to keep going from there. All right. So starting off, we're going to talk about Charles Darwin, the dude who discovered natural selection. All right, so here's some 4 facts about Charles Darwin. Number 1, he is considered the father of evolution. Number 2, he wrote a 1858 book on the origin of species. He was a naturalist and a keen observer. And he spent over 5 years on a ship called the HMS Beagle, visiting many parts of the world. So a naturalist is someone who observes nature. So he was very interested in what he was observing in the natural world. Okay. All right, so here is some information on the voyage of the HMS Beagle, Charles Darwin's ship. He was interested in the Galapagos Islands off of Ecuador. So that's the region where he was most interested, right here, this little area. But why? Well, there were many small islands, all had different climates, so they had very different environments on each island. They had many organisms that were similar, but all were slightly different and perfectly adapted to their environments. So if you think back to the Beaks of Finches lab, you should remember that the environment determines what species live or die. So if all of these small islands have different climates, they have different environments, that means different beaks, different traits are going to be favorable on different islands because their climates and environments are all different. Okay, so for example, if there are large seeds found on one island, that will favor birds with big edge-crushing beaks, versus if on another island there's only small seeds, then that's going to favor birds with small, narrow, pointy beaks. So that's just one example. Okay, and he noted the variety, meaning differences in tortoise species and finch species. So he noticed there were many, many different kinds of finches on these islands, many different kinds of tortoises on these islands. So here is a map of his voyage. So as you can see, he traveled across the Indian Ocean, through the Atlantic, and then around South America to get to the Galapagos Islands. Right? He studied and collected biological and fossil specimens at every port along the route. So here are diagrams of the beaks of finches, as well as sketches of the tortoises that he observed on the Galapagos Islands. And he became curious about the relationships among the species, among the different species, because of all the similarities that he saw. Okay, so here are some adaptations of Galapagos tortoises. So if you remember what we talked about yesterday, an adaptation is a trait that is favorable in an environment that allows a certain species to survive. So that is what it is, a favorable trait. So Darwin noticed that on 2 different islands of the Galapagos, they had very different environments. So here on this island, there was vegetation low to the ground, and over here there were tall bushes. So what do you know? These tortoises, the ones with helmet-shaped shells, were favored because they could reach their food. So this was more favorable. And so the tortoises with helmet-shaped shells were able to survive, reproduce, pass on that trait until you have an island with many, many helmet-shaped tortoises. However, On this island, the vegetation, the plants are high up. They cannot reach if they have helmet-shaped shells. So the helmet-shaped trait on this island over here is not favorable at all because they cannot reach their food. So now the saddleback trait, the saddle-shaped shells are more favorable because it allows the turtle to stretch their neck and reach the plants. So this trait here is favored over the helmet-shaped shells. So as you can see, two different environments had on two different islands determined what trait was favored. Okay, and he noticed there were 14 different species of tortoise on the Galapagos Island. They all came from a common ancestor millions of years ago. Okay. So one of the things Darwin observed in nature is that the traits of individual vary in populations. Darwin hypothesized that there was a force in nature that picked which traits or variations are better for the survival in a population. Okay, so that is natural selection. Nature or the environment determines which traits are beneficial, and only those organisms with the beneficial traits are going to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits to the next generation. So here's a little question for you to brainstorm. Give some examples of variations in populations of one species. So for example, the beaks of finches. What else can you think of? Okay, and Darwin found many unique species. So there's a tortoise, iguana, birds. So we found much variation among species on the Galapagos Islands. And this made him wonder what's causing all these variations. And why were they only found on the Galapagos Islands? So Darwin found evidence that creatures changed over time. Here is the picture of the present day armadillo. Here's a picture of the ancient armadillo. So as you can see, over time, different traits were favored by the environment. So maybe the environment changed. Millions of years ago, the environment was different than it is now. So over time, there's a gradual change. Certain traits are favored, and only those organisms with the favorable traits survive, reproduce, pass on those traits. And now, in the present day, the armadillo looks different from what it looked like millions of years ago. Okay? So here's more evidence. He found fossils, such as the bones of a giant ground sloth, which is an extinct species of sloth. And he noticed that there were differences from the present-day sloth and compared to the giant ground sloth millions of years ago. And here's the shells, the differences in the shells that we were talking about as well. And Darwin asked, is there a relationship between what the environment is and what an animal looks like? And as we learned in the Beaks of Finches lab, yes, there is. That is called natural selection. He found many different birds on the Galapagos Islands. He thought they were very different kinds, but they were all 14 species. All 14 species were finches, so they were very closely related to each other, but they were all different, slightly different from each other. But there was only one species of finch on the mainland. So he asked, if the Galapagos finches came from the mainland, why are they all so different now? So these finches on the Galapagos Islands must have all come from the mainland. So different beaks are inherited variations. Okay? And the different beaks serve as adaptations. Ding, ding, ding. There's that word, adaptation again. That is a favorable trait that allows an organism to survive and reproduce and pass on its traits. Okay, so they serve these differences in beak shape and size serve as adaptations that help birds to compete for food. And then these birds survive and reproduce, and then they pass on their genes for those more fit beaks. So, fit not meaning buff and that you work out a lot. Fit means that you are best suited to the environment. You have that favorable trait, and you are going to survive. Those organisms are more likely to survive. The ones that are fit have the favorable trait, okay? And over time, nature selects for different species with different beaks. Okay, so you started off with one finch species who came to an island in the Galapagos, came to many of the different islands in the Galapagos. And since each island has a very different environment, different traits, different beak sizes and shapes are selected for on each of the individual islands. And over time, that change becomes more emphasized. That trait is favored on each one of those islands, and as those finches survive, reproduce, pass on that trait, on each island you'll find a different variation of the finch, and over time you get different species of the finch as those differences become more pronounced. Okay, so here it shows you that you started off with one ancestor from the mainland, but on each different island, since the environment is very different, it selects for a different trait, and then that trait becomes more frequent in the population due to those species with the favorable trait surviving, reproducing, and passing on that trait. So here were Darwin's conclusions. There were variations in beaks, differences in beaks in the original flock, adaptations to foods available on the island. So for example, large beaks are better suited for eating large seeds. Small beaks, small pointy, thin beaks are adaptations for eating small seeds. Natural selection favors the organisms that are most fit, so the ones that have the favorable trait or adaptation, and then that trait is selected for, and over time it becomes more frequent in the population. Offspring inherit successful traits, so if you survive, then you reproduce and pass on those traits. Remember, you can't reproduce if you're dead. Okay, and then over time, as the frequency of these traits increase in the population, different species emerge. So on different islands, different traits are favored, and then eventually, as those differences become more pronounced, you have 2 different species of finches. So that's how you ended up with 14 different finch species. Okay, so here you can see all of the different finch species, and they have different diets, different types of beaks, different beak shapes and sizes. And this shows variation. So variation sounds like variety. It's a variety, the differences between the beaks, differences in the trait. And then the variation, because there's so much variation, that leads to natural selection for only the organisms that are best suited for the environment. The ones that have the favorable trait will survive and reproduce and then pass on that trait. Okay? And that's all I have for you today. You are now to work on page 259. Follow the directions. I will leave colored pencils for you to color in the finches that have different types of beaks. Okay. And then you are doing a simulation on the peppered moth. Okay. The substitute should have more information on that. It'll be posted on Google Classroom. Okay. I miss you and looking forward to seeing you again on Friday.